Chapters 1 through 3 of The Art of Divine Contentment. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jen Raimundo. The Art of Divine Contentment by Thomas Watson. Chapters 1 through 3. The Art of Divine Contentment, an exposition of Philippians chapter 4, verse 11. I have learned, in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. Chapter 1. The Introduction to the Text. These words are brought in by way of palepsis to anticipate and prevent an objection. The Apostle had, in the former verse, laid down many grave and heavenly exhortations, among the rest, to be careful for nothing. Not to exclude, 1. A prudential care, for he that provideth not for his own house hath denied the faith, and is worse than an infidel. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8. Nor, 2. A religious care, for we must give all diligence to make our calling and election sure. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 10. But 3. To exclude all anxious care about the issues and events of things. Take no thought for your life, what ye shall eat. Matthew chapter 6, verse 25. And in this sense, it should be a Christian's care not to be careful. The word careful in the Greek comes from the primitive that signifies to cut the heart in pieces, a soul-dividing care. Take heed of this. We are bid to commit our way unto the Lord. Psalm 37, verse 5. The Hebrew word is, roll thy way upon the Lord. It is our work to cast away care. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7. And it is God's work to take care. By our immoderacy we take his work out of his hand. Care, when it is eccentric, either distrustful or distracting, is very dishonorable to God. It takes away his providence, as if he sat in heaven and minded not what became of things here below, like a man that makes a clock and then leaves it to go for itself. Immoderate care takes the heart off from better things, and usually while we are thinking how we shall do to live, we forget how to die. Care is a spiritual canker that doth waste and dispirit. We may sooner by our care add a furlong to our grief than a cubit to our comfort. God doth threaten it as a curse. They shall eat their bread with carefulness. Ezekiel chapter 12, verse 1. Better fast than eat of that bread. Be careful for nothing. Now, lest anyone should say, Yea, Paul, thou preachest that to us which thou hast scarce learned thyself. Hast thou learned not to be careful? The apostle seemed tacitly to answer that, in the words of the text, I have learned, in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. A speech worthy to be engraven upon our hearts, and to be written in letters of gold upon the crowns and diadems of princes. The text doth branch itself into these two general parts. 1. The scholar, Paul. I have learned. And 2. The lesson, in every state to be content. Chapter 2. The first branch of the text, the scholar, with the first proposition. I begin with the first, the scholar and his proficiency. I have learned, out of which I shall by the by observe two things by way of paraphrase. 1. The apostle doth not say, I have heard, that in every state I should be content, but I have learned. Whence our first doctrine, that it is not enough for Christians to hear their duty, but they must learn their duty. It is one thing to hear and another thing to learn, as it is one thing to eat and another thing to concoct. St. Paul was a practitioner. Christians hear much, but, it is to be feared, learn little. There were 4 sorts of grounds in the parable, Luke chapter 8, verse 5, and but one good ground, an emblem of this truth, many hearers, but few learners. There are 2 things which keep us from learning. 1. Slighting what we hear. Christ is the pearl of price. When we disesteem this pearl, we shall never learn its value or its virtue. The gospel is a rare mystery. In one place, Acts chapter 20, verse 24, it is called the gospel of grace. In another, 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4, the gospel of glory. Because in it, as in a transparent glass, the glory of God is resplendent. But he that hath learned to condemn this mystery will hardly ever learn to obey it. He that looks upon the things of heaven as things by the by, and perhaps the driving of a trade, or carrying on some politic design to be of greater importance, this man is in the high road to damnation, and will hardly ever learn the things of his peace. Who will learn that which he thinks is scarce worth learning? 2. Forgetting what we hear. If a scholar have his rules laid before him, and he forgets them as fast as he reads them, he will never learn. James chapter 1, verse 25. Aristotle calls the memory the scribe of the soul, and Bernard calls it the stomach of the soul, because it hath a retentive faculty, and turns heavenly food into blood and spirits. We have great memories in other things. We remember that which is vain. Cyrus could remember the name of every soldier in his huge army. We remember injuries. This is to fill a precious cabinet with dung. But as Hiram saith, how soon do we forget the sacred truths of God? We are apt to forget three things: our faults, our friends, our instructions. Many Christians are like sieves. Put a sieve into the water, and it is full. But take it forth of the water, and all runs out. So, while they are hearing a sermon, they remember something. But like the sieve out of the water, as soon as they are gone out of the church, all is forgotten. Let these sayings, saith Christ, sink down into your ears. Luke chapter 9, verse 44. In the original it is, put these sayings into your ears, as a man that would hide the jewel from being stolen locks it up safe in his chest. Let them sink. The word must not fall only as dew that wets the leaf, but as rain which soaks to the root of the tree and makes it fructify. Oh, how often doth Satan, that fowl of the air, pick up the good seed that is sown? Use. Let me put you upon a serious trial. Some of you have heard much. You have lived 40, 50, 60 years under the blessed trumpet of the gospel. What have you learned? You may have heard 1,000 sermons, and yet not learned one. Search your consciences. 1. You have heard much against sin. Are you hearers, or are you scholars? How many sermons have you heard against covetousness, that it is the root on which pride, idolatry, treason do grow? One calls it a metropolitan sin. It is a complex evil. It doth twist a great many sins in with it. There is hardly any sin, but covetousness is a main ingredient of it. And yet are you like the 2 daughters of the horseleech that cry, Give, give. How much have you heard against rash anger, that it is a short frenzy, a dry drunkenness, that it rests in the bosom of fools, and upon the least occasion do your spirits begin to take fire? How much have you heard against swearing? It is Christ's express mandate, swear not at all. Matthew chapter 5, verse 34. This sin of all others may be termed the unfruitful work of darkness. It is neither sweetened with pleasure, nor enriched with profit, the usual vermilion wherewith Satan doth paint sin. Swearing is forbidden with a subpoena. While the swearer shoots his oaths like flying arrows at God to pierce his glory, God shoots a flying roll of curses against him. And do you make your tongue a racket by which you toss oaths as tennis balls? Do you sport yourselves with oaths, as the Philistines did with Samson, which will at last pull the house about your ears? Alas, how have they learned what sin is that have not learned to leave sin? Doth he know what a viper is that will play with it? 2. You have heard much of Christ. Have you learned Christ? The Jews, as Jerome saith, carried Christ in their Bibles, but not in their heart. Their sound went into all the earth, Romans chapter 10, verse 18. The prophets and apostles were as trumpets, whose sound went abroad into the world. Yet many thousands who heard the noise of these trumpets had not learned Christ. They have not all obeyed, Romans chapter 10, verse 16. 1. A man may know much of Christ, and yet not learn Christ. The devils knew Christ, Matthew chapter 1, verse 24. 2. A man may preach Christ, and yet not learn Christ, as Judas and the pseudo-apostles. Philippians chapter 2, verse 15. 3. A man may profess Christ, and yet not learn Christ. There are many professors in the world that Christ will profess against. Matthew chapter 7, verses 22 and 23. Question. What is it then to learn Christ? 1. To learn Christ is to be made like Christ, to have the divine characters of his holiness engraven upon our hearts. We all, with open face, beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord, are changed into the same image. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18. There is a metamorphosis made. A sinner, viewing Christ's image in the glass of the gospel, is transformed into that image. Never did any man look upon Christ with a spiritual eye, but he went away quite changed. A true saint is a divine landscape picture, where all the rare beauties of Christ are lively portrayed and drawn forth. He hath the same spirit, the same judgment, the same will, with Jesus Christ. 2. To learn Christ is to believe in him, my Lord and my God, John chapter 20, verse 28, when we do not only believe God, but in God, which is the actual application of Christ to ourselves, and as it were the spreading of the sacred medicine of his blood upon our souls. You have heard much of Christ, and yet cannot with an humble adherence say, My Jesus. Be not offended if I tell you the devil can say his creed as well as you. 3. To learn Christ is to love Christ. When we have Bible conversations, our lives like rich diamonds cast a sparkling lustre in the church of God, and are in some sense parallel with the life of Christ, as the transcript with the original. So much for the first notion of the word. Chapter 3. Concerning the second proposition. This word, I have learned, is a word that imports difficulty. It shows how hardly the apostle came by contentment of mind. It was not bred in nature. St. Paul did not come naturally by it, but he had learned it. It cost him many a prayer and tear. It was taught him by the Spirit. Whence our second doctrine. Good things are hard to come by. The business of religion is not so facile as most do imagine. I have learned, saith St. Paul. Indeed, you need not learn a man to sin. This is natural, Psalm 58, verse 3, and therefore facile. It comes as water out of a spring. It is an easy thing to be wicked. Hell will be taken without storm. But matters of religion must be learned. To cut the flesh is easy, but to prick a vein and not to cut an artery is hard. The trade of sin needs not to be learned, but the art of divine contentment is not achieved without holy industry. I have learned. There are two pregnant reasons why there must be so much study and exercitation. 1. Because spiritual things are against nature. Everything in religion is antipodes to nature. There are in religion two things, and both are against nature. 1, matters of faith, as for men to be justified by the righteousness of another, to become a fool that he may be wise, to save all by losing all. This is against nature. 2, matters of practice, as self-denial, for man to deny his own wisdom and see himself blind, his own will and have it melted into the will of God, plucking out the right eye, beheading and crucifying that sin which is the favourite and lies nearest to the heart, for a man to be dead to the world and in the midst of want to abound, for him to take up the cross and follow Christ not only in golden but in bloody paths, to embrace religion when it is dressed in night clothes, all the jewels of honour and preferment being pulled off. This is against nature, and therefore must be learned. Self-examination, for a man to take his heart as a watch all in pieces, to set up a spiritual inquisition or court of conscience, and traverse things in his own soul, to take David's candle and lantern, Psalm 119, verse 105, and search for sin, nay, as judge, to pass the sentence upon himself, 2 Samuel chapter 34, verse 17. This is against nature, and will not easily be attained to without learning. Self-reformation, to see a man as Caleb or another spirit walking antipodes to himself, the current of his life altered, and running into the channel of religion. This is wholly against nature. When a stone ascends, it is not a natural motion, but a violent. The motion of the soul heavenward is a violent motion. It must be learned. Flesh and blood is not skilled in these things. Nature can no more cast out nature than Satan can cast out Satan. 2. Because spiritual things are above nature. There are some things in nature that are hard to find out, as the cause of things, which are not learned without study. Aristotle, a great philosopher, whom some have called an eagle fallen from the clouds, yet could not find out the motion of the river Euripus, and therefore threw himself into it. What then are divine things which are in a sphere above nature and beyond all human disquisition, as the Trinity, the hypostatical union, the mystery of faith to believe against hope? Only God's Spirit can light our candle here. The apostle calls these the deep things of God. The gospel is full of jewels, but they are locked up from sense and reason. The angels in heaven are searching into those sacred depths. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 22. Use. Let us beg the Spirit of God to teach us. We must be divinely taught. The eunuch could read, but he could not understand till Philip joined himself to his chariot. Acts chapter 8, verse 29. God's Spirit must join himself to our chariot. He must teach, or we cannot learn. All thy children shall be taught of the Lord. Isaiah chapter 54, verse 13. A man may read the figure on the dial, but he cannot tell how the day goes unless the sun shines upon the dial. We may read the Bible over, but we cannot learn the purpose till the Spirit of God shines into our hearts. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 6. Oh, implore this blessed Spirit. It is God's prerogative royal to teach. I am the Lord thy God, which teacheth thee to profit. Isaiah chapter 48, verse 17. Ministers may tell us our lesson. God only can teach us. We have lost both our hearing and eyesight, therefore are very unfit to learn. Ever since Eve listened to the serpent, we have been deaf, and since she looked on the tree of knowledge, we have been blind. But when God comes to teach, he removes these impediments. Isaiah chapter 35, verse 5. We are naturally dead. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 1. Who will go about to teach a dead man? Yet behold, God undertakes to make dead men to understand mysteries. God is the grand teacher. This is the reason the word preached works so differently upon men. Two in a pew, the one is wrought upon effectually, the other lies at the ordinances as a dead child at the breast, and gets no nourishment. What is the reason? Because the heavenly gale of the Spirit blows upon one, and not upon the other. One hath the anointing of God, which teacheth him all things. 1 John chapter 2, verse 27. The other hath it not. God's Spirit speaks sweetly, but irresistibly. In that heavenly doxology, none could sing the new song but those who were sealed in their foreheads. Revelation chapter 14, verse 2. Reprobates could not sing it. Those that are skillful in the mysteries of salvation must have the seal of the Spirit upon them. Let us make this our prayer. Lord, breathe thy Spirit into thy word, and we have a promise, which may add wings to prayer. If ye then, being evil, know how to give good gifts unto your children, how much more shall your heavenly Father give the Holy Spirit to them that ask him? Luke chapter 11, verse 13. And thus much of the first part of the text, the scholar, which I intended only as a short gloss or paraphrase. End of chapters 1 through 3, recording by Jen Raimundo.